what role might memory play in our sense of identity and even our path of spiritual awakening? This week's show is with guest Anthony Metivier. Anthony is the founder of the Magnetic Memory Method, a systematic 21st century approach to memorizing foreign language vocabulary, names, music, poetry, and much more in ways that are easy, elegant, effective, and fun. In this show, we explore the profound themes of memory, identity, and spiritual practice. We delve into the intricate nature of memory, explore its definitions, implications, and the philosophical questions surrounding it. Our conversation highlights the complexity of memory as both a scientific and philosophical spiritual topic, emphasizing the importance of questioning and exploring rather than seizing definitive answers. I hope this episode can be part of that exploration for you. And before we jump into all of that juicy stuff, if you are struggling with the challenges of this crazy modern world as you are walking your soul path and you would benefit from guidance, support, and kinship, come join us at our Academy of the Soul, Unio. You can find out more by hopping on over to bemythical.com/Unio now or click the link in the description. And now let's dive into the show. Hello, Anthony. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Lian. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I am really looking forward to this episode. It feels slightly different to, well, not that there is a kind of typical topic, but I've certainly not, I don't think in 10 years of doing the podcast, I don't think I've ever had anyone on talking about memory. Which in itself, I was pondering earlier, was an intriguing thing. The fact that we don't tend to talk about memory very often. So yes, I'm really looking forward to getting into this with you. And I would love to start a kind of really the basics, which is firstly, why is memory your jam? But also, what is even memory? So it might be that could be a very long answer. So feel free to break it down and pause. But that's what I'd love to know. Kind of why memory?
Yeah, well, I'm a little surprised at my own interest in it because it just seems to have been the muse that grabbed hold of me and makes demands of my flesh, and my intellect or whatever I have to constantly bang on this hammer of whatever memory is. But the interesting answer to the question, what is memory, is that some of the most exciting things that are happening in memory science is they want to get rid of the word memory because it doesn't really help explain what's going on, right?
Oh,
And in some sense,
you tease beginning there.
well, in some sense, it's never really, like in memory science, it's never really been just one word, or at least not for a long time. So there's been things like ekphory, and there's engrams, and there's things like autobiographical memory and figural memory and spatial memory. And I can go down this long list. And so the way I think about it is, imagine your brain has multiple engines, or perhaps there's like a carburetor and like pistons or something like that. And so each of these little engines or parts of an engine, they collaborate in particular ways to create the experience that we have, our perception of the experience. And I mean, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it per se, but if we just live in science world and we be materialists for a second, that would be, I think, the conclusion. Memory is a series of engines that produce how we perceive the external world. And Andy Clark would say, and he's a neuroscientist, or I think that's his label with all the alphabet soup at the end of people's names. He has a recent book called The Experience Machine. So the brain has memory that creates our experiences. It's literally a machine that creates what we think, how we think about it, what we feel, how we feel about it. And he's great. He gets into like how pain is experienced and all this sort of stuff. And so that fascinates me. And I also live in another world, which is, how do you memorize stuff? And that is a very, very deep rabbit hole. But I love that too. So I kind of merge these things together. And one of the reasons why I merge it together is because one of my mentors was Harry Lorraine, and he taught me the basics of the business of doing memory training. And he said, whatever you do not talk to people about the science. It will bring pain to their eyes. And he talked about how he just never does it because he can't stand seeing people frustrated and confused. And he's also a mass marketer. And I just thought, I will never, ever, ever take that advice because
Mm.
this is the 21st century. We have the tools of analysis and so forth. So we got to be able to. I mean, it would just be ridiculous to have this great memory that you've trained and then to just ignore all these cool words and not memorize them, not learn
Yes.
them. So
Mm.
I think it's not a right or wrong thing, but he lived in a particular time and he was on, what is it, Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show. Like, I think he was one of the guests that was on that show the most.
Mm.
So
Oh,
like he
really?
knew
Mm.
marketing, and he knew how to make a fast sale basically on these trainings. And he was a magician, he was a showman, and so forth. But I don't know why, but I'm a bit of a contrarian, I guess. I just totally went against that advice and learned everything, and I continue to learn everything that I can about memory. But
Mm.
I mean, there's more to the story than that. But if we think about what memory is and we do it in a material sense or a scientific sense, it literally is a piece of meat in our skulls that somehow has these little engines that produce a effect.
Mm. So there's something that comes to mind. I can't remember where this notion comes from. You may well know and remember. Um, but it's this um, recognition that over the ages, depending on the cutting edge science of the time, we use that as a metaphor for how our minds, brains, psyches work. So, kind of like in, say, for example, a hydraulic era, we would use that metaphor to
Mm-hmm.
describe how our brains work. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? I can't think of what this whole idea is called, but I
Yes, and
think you get my
that's a
point.
very important and exciting place to go. That's actually, this is the key. Where you're going
Mm,
is, I believe, the key is to understand that. If I can just jump into it without hearing the
mm.
question or where you're going exactly, but like
Well, can
there's a
I just
philosopher
throw
named,
this little bit in? Because there was
yeah,
a
yeah,
slight kind of like, it was like, there's that, but there's also a slight, maybe challenge in that I mean, you've used the word engine rather than sometimes people might use a more of like a computer or even these days an AI analogy. Um, but there is, of course, it's limited, like the very metaphor and our understanding is limited by the science of our time or the technology of our time. And so I kind of wanted to sort of throw that in, but feel free to now go where you want. And if you can sort of
yeah.
journey into answering that at the same time, too.
Well, that's the problem, right? It's limited, but it's not limited. The limit itself is a metaphor. The idea of a limit is itself the metaphor that we perceive, and then we put, because we have a perception of this outer region or the capping on it, then we use these words that then effectively creates a limit. It's like a metaphorical truth or a mythical truth, right? But we don't know that there's a limit. We have other words. So this is what's so exciting about it, right? Is that if you can do stuff like I've done, where you memorize a couple thousand words of Sanskrit, and that Sanskrit is designed to like silence your mind, and you start to perceive a world that is not so symbol based or not so computational or not so constantly labeling things, then you're kind of free to float a different level of experience. But is that level of experience now bound or not bound by memory? And the answer, according to the Sanskrit, is that it's irrelevant, because whatever conclusion you arrive at, you just ask more questions about it, right? But
Mm,
so the prison house of language, I think Frederick Jameson called it. We're just locked. We're locked in this constant referentiality, right? And
mm,
our intuition about using language to refer to things isn't necessarily wrong, because in the physics equations, what you'll probably see is that this is linked to that, and it's just cause and effect all the way down. This is what Spinoza was going on about ad infinitum. It's just there's a sense in which it's all a production of itself out of itself.
Mm.
There's nothing outside of it, right? So the idea of a limit doesn't make sense. We can use
Well,
that term, but what would that limit be? If a network is building itself out of itself, what limit?
yes, I hear you. And I guess it's whoever's understanding of the word, like the idea that these engines, and I guess it's
Mm,
like by its very nature, we have a concept of, oh, therefore engines in themselves have this
mm,
kind of definition. And I understand what you're saying. Firstly, it's just a word, but also it's kind
mm.
of like who gets to decide there is a limitation even within that frame.
Yeah.
Something just came to mind, which feels possibly a bit left field, but as we've kind of gone directly to talking about symbols, I heard you mention when I was listening to you on my friend Steve's Guru Viking podcast, you were talking about Dr. Martin Jeffries' work. I don't know if you know of it via his work, but the non-symbolic experience way of talking about kind of like it's a bit of a instead of directly talking about, I don't know, awakening or enlightenment, he's talking about kind of experiencing life kind of without symbols in quote marks.
Mm.
Do you remember talking about that?
Yeah, I think I remember Jeffrey Martin and
Did I
PNSE.
say Martin Jeffrey? Jeffrey Martin. I think I said it
I'm
the other
not
way
sure.
around.
You could be right.
No,
You
but I
could be
think
right,
you're
but
right.
the reason why I pause upon that is because I either have to ruin my reputation or remember was it that? But and that's the beautiful question, right? That's what I love about memory. I actually love thinking, did I remember that correctly or not? But I believe there's a guy named Jeffrey Martin who has persistent non-symbolic experience, or PNSE, as a term or a label or something
Mm.
like this. And if you read his research, there's 8 levels. I think that it's eight
Yes.
different
I
kinds.
geeked out big time on his work a long time ago now, maybe 8 years ago. So I'm not especially fresh on it, but at the
Mm,
time, I kind of, it was a rabbit hole I went deep down into because it seemed a useful framing.
yeah. Well, where I would just go immediately is he uses the word levels, right? Now, I can take issue with that, right? And I could say, well, you should call them engines or whatever, because I like engines and pistons and carburetors and stuff. I'm actually not mechanically minded. It just somehow engine makes sense to me. But I really don't care what you call it. I often think about Kierkegaard, who said, "Do it this way, do it that way. Either way, you will regret it." Like it doesn't. It's just this word game, right? And I don't particular like. I studied Nietzsche very young, or maybe not that young, but whatever. And Nietzsche makes this point, and it's a point that I think we all need, which is that power has a function, which is that it makes you want more power, right? So if we get precious about, well, we actually should call it levels, or we should call it engines, or we should call it this or call it that, then we're getting a little bit of power if we get to be right, right?
Mm,
And it's just words. And Jacques Lacan pointed out there's too many words to ever reach the truth, right? You just blah 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 blah, and that's what I found so useful, because I used to be this guy who was like, no, this is the way that it was in Latin, and now over in the 18th century it was modified by such and such, and so in common usage this is how it, like it's just I couldn't see I couldn't even see myself doing it, right? I couldn't be free from the actual dialectic or discourse or change and like, well, we spin the word this way and that way. I was spinning it all right, but I was trying to find the combination to open a lock, not realizing
mm,
that the lock and the combination and the numbers are all built out of the same thing, right? They're
mm,
just it's just a field of reference. So, and I
mm.
needed memory. I needed to retrain my memory literally in order to be able to do it.
Mm. So let's come back to, well, it's interesting because that very first question I asked you is what is memory? And we're now kind of picking like, is there even memory? Um,
I don't think
but
so. There is in some ways of looking at things. There's definitely memory in it, or at least I have an experience of memory that, and it can be trained, And you can say there's a level of this and you can get black belt of that if you train in such a way. And some people do that. There's memory competitions where you can be a warrior of the mind, which is something I was given, or you can be a grand master of memory or whatever, right? There's all kinds of levels and stuff. But and that seems to be real. But in terms of, if we're going to get into ontology, like what is the nature of being, if we're going to get into metaphysics, what's the nature of reality, all that stuff, that's a different proposition. And I don't think there is such a thing as memory, or only at the most pathetic level of reality is there such a thing as memory. So
Mm. So going back to this notion of these engines, you're saying for you they aren't in themselves. They're not kind of memory engines. They are engines producing something that we experience and name as memory.
well, they're science words that help people in laboratories create charts and graphs and diagrams, and they, like everybody else, have to do something until they die. So there's an anthropology to be done, like, well, why is it that they're studying all this memory? And it's, what happened with Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1895 that he felt so compelled to memorize, I think in German they're called sinnlose Silben, or nonsense syllables, and he derived from memorizing all these three-letter words that make no sense what we now call the forgetting curve. Like, he tracked how long it would take him to forget words that have no meaning. And then from that, after he derived, or I don't know if it's exactly after he derived the forgetting curve, but then he figured out these principles called primacy effect, recency effect, and serial positioning effect. But like, I haven't gone and done the study. Nietzsche was alive at that time, but I haven't like known whether Nietzsche knew Ebbinghaus or not. Apparently, Nietzsche, though, wrote his dissertation on Simonides of Kos, who is attributed with, in some stories, the origin of what's called the memory palace technique, which is one of the mnemonic
Oh,
strategies that
yeah.
memory
Mm.
competitors use. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's in a footnote in one of Nietzsche's books that was what his dissertation was on, and I haven't found actually his dissertation to confirm or deny this. But nonetheless, why I'm mentioning all of this is it would be a job for somebody to figure out, why is it that scientists ever thought to study memory in the first place, right? And I don't know the answer, but I do know that there's really interesting figures like Richard Seaman and Endel Tulving and all these guys, and they came up with all these words like episodic memory, autobiographical memory, and distinguishing the every jot and tittle about like how this works. And then here's the thing that might fascinate people: we actually don't really know much about memory from brain scans. There are some brain
Mm.
scans and they show certain things, but it doesn't really give us that much information. Most of what scientists are talking about when they talk about memory this and memory that are behavioral psychology studies, right?
Mm.
Um, and that's partly my observation, but it's partly things that other people have noticed. In If you read the memory science, there's really not that much to know from neuroscience. You can know about the nodes of Ranvier and the transmission of positive and negative ions through synapses, and the pressure of dendritic spines. And I've just memorized all these words. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. But you know what I'm saying? I'm not diminishing my image of what is going on in the brain either. But the point is there's a culture around it. There's a story. There's a history to it, and somebody must have gotten some sort of thrill out of it, or some kind of paycheck, or both. And it's just, I don't know. It's just fascinating. But
Mm.
that doesn't mean that we can then say, okay, so autobiographical memory, I want to improve that specifically. You might be able to, and I can propose ways to do it, but it's ultimately a scientific term that helps produce charts and diagrams and
Mm.
maybe some research grants. Like what
Yeah.
it all means. And maybe it will help. And that's, I'm joking to kind of poke fun at my fellow scholars, but also there's the positive, which is it could help lead us to ideas that help solve problems like dementia and Alzheimer's.
Mm. I was just thinking there's I guess, a medical function
Yeah.
for some of this work.
So the
So,
stakes are high somewhere.
mm. So when we're talking about, so there's two questions just come to mind. One, you were talking about these engines creating, like working together to create our experience. By that, are you saying that's responsible, these sort of memory like engine things are creating all of our experience? That that's your what you're seeing is happening. Those engines are what's creating our experience.
Well, I mean, this is where one can get into some very interesting topics and discussions and so forth. I don't know that that's what I think. I try to. I mean, I memorize Sanskrit and I listen deeply to what that says. And basically, what I have interpreted from the particular kinds of Sanskrit that I've memorized is that trying to find a final answer is like finding a rabbit with horns. You know, like it's just like I'm not playing that game. I don't have any special truth to arrive at. I keep coming back to this book that I try to write called A Philosophy of Memory, and I always stop because it's just a dumb project, right? Because what would a philosophy of memory be? Like there's and I'm not a memory. I mean, I sometimes in quotes in my emails put memory scientist, but I always put it in quotes, right? Because I do memory science in the sense that I memorize stuff. And if I memorize it correctly, then I've proved the hypothesis that memory techniques work. But I'm not in a lab running experiments. I want to. I hope to one day actually construct experiments. But in a way, I don't have to because there's all kinds of experiments and I just read them. But in terms of trying to come to a final statement, what I would really say is I have a question and I don't know the answer. And the question is memory nested in consciousness or is consciousness nested in memory? And if so, what changes if one is true and one is proven false,
Mm.
right? And I can already sort of tell you the answer. I don't care. Because the question is so much more interesting than the answer. And we know this, right? Because I've done magic tricks for a long time. I've done magic tricks since I was a little kid. And when people force me to show them the secret to how the magic trick was done, the magic is gone
It's so
instantly.
disappointing.
And in science, that can happen as well, right? Oh, that's solved, put it in the
Mm.
shelf. And it's no longer interesting, right?
Mm.
So I really don't want to have the mystery solved, and I don't think most people want the mystery solved either. There's too
Mm.
much pleasure in the pain and too much pain in the pleasure, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Okay, so this might be slightly left field, but one of the things I was pondering before we spoke was coming into this kind of relatively fresh, as in, it's not memory's not something I've spent a huge amount of time thinking about. Um, and I was like, So initially, when I was thinking about our conversation, I was thinking memory being the thing that most people talk about when they talk about memory, things that you remember really from this lifetime. So experiences you've had that somehow are stored somewhere that you can recall, in put it in very, very basic terms.
Mm.
And then I was like, what I would love to know from your experience is that what you see is all that's going on? Or do you, when you think of the word memory, and again, I appreciate there is this kind of does it even exist aspect, but kind of at the level that I'm asking you, could memory be from past lives, from ancestors, from the land, from our bodies?
Mm. Well, of
So
course, memories
you've.
from past lives. I mean, we read the books of dead people. Like, to me, the whole reincarnation thing to me is just like, okay, like think. So here's an interesting idea that I got from Spinoza, and I think Spinoza is just so next level, but he's kind of hard to read, right? So I might have misread him. This might all be wrong, but what I think he's saying, and this is in the glorious part 5 of his book, The Ethics. This is the idea I get. I'm a piece of meat, right? I'm literally this machine that is made somehow from materials that appear in the world, right? And
Can you be a piece of
information.
meat and a machine? I think you have
Sure,
to
there's a
choose. You can be both.
sure, why not? See, category, right? Category can be blurred, right?
Okay.
Category can be confused. This is an Aristotle question, actually, and it's in the memory history. There's a guy named Giordano Bruno who was a memory teacher and a philosopher, and they burned him at the stake because he went against things that Aristotle said, which Aristotle actually acknowledged himself, which is what makes it so bizarre. But nobody wanted it. The church didn't want people to know that Aristotle acknowledged these problems with his
Mm.
own theory. Anyway, the machine and the organic and so forth, we are making a mistake when we create a duality between this, right? We're making a deep, deep fundamental error. And the reason why is I'm just saying, like, I'm saying that I'm a piece of meat to get to the metaphor, to get to an image. It doesn't have to be this image. There's probably too many possible images. But what I get out of Spinoza is that humans are essentially meat that remembers. But the information that we remember, it flows through, and some of it stays as sediment. And so when I die, the information that flows through me is just going to flow into somebody else. So the reincarnation part is guaranteed. Like he literally says, you don't have to worry about not living forever. You already are the product of forever life because the information, the thinking, the coding, the referentiality, the symbolism, your brain is a machine that does that to you. You don't have to do it. The machine is causing you to do it. Nietzsche says the same thing in also spoke Zarathustra. I know German, so it's also sprach Zarathustra. He says, "You will not believe me when I say this to you, but it is the body that performs the I." And he's saying a very similar thing. Every word that comes out of your
Mm.
mouth is the reincarnation of the dead, right? We're making a dead thing alive by speaking the language. We've got some Latin in it, we've got some Greek in it, we've got some French in it, we've got some Anglo-Saxon in it. We are, we're back from the dead as we speak. And these words that we're saying, it might not be these exact words, but the code from which they're drawn will flow into other meat tubes or microtubules, as Sir Roger Penrose has been talking about lately with his orchestrated objective reduction, which is an interesting application of physics to memory in many, many ways, which I'm not qualified to talk about, but I memorized the words that he says. Anyway, the thing is I think I get the gist of what he's saying. What he's orchestrated objective reduction is a lot like what Spinoza is saying, I think, is that there's this thing of consciousness that is embodied in a case or a sheath, which is what the ancient Sanskrit dudes were talking about as well.
Mm.
The koshas, I think, is the word in Sanskrit for the five sheaths. And then what basically happens is that some information flows through it, and then it just keeps on flowing. And then this thing dissembles, but it dissembles into what? It dissembles into the next form of itself. Because reality
Mm.
appears to be building itself out of what? Out of non-being. Well, what's the opposite of being? Non-being? No. It's just this is just happening, and it's a process. And some of us have different awarenesses of it, and so forth. And we just trade our words, but the words themselves are the reincarnation.
Mm. So, if I remember rightly, it seems funny how many times I'm saying the word remember during this conversation. I'm thinking, do I normally say it this much? Because it's not intentional. If I remember rightly, earlier in the conversation, you were saying you have kind of like two interests as far as memory is concerned, these sort of two broad categories, one being kind of understanding what's going on and the science of it, and the other being the kind of actually memorizing things. Um, but it sounds like so much through your conversation, and you might say, well, no, that is it. It seems like it's so beyond that. It feels as though so much of our conversation has been at, I guess, a metaphysical level rather than what I would have thought was either of those two things.
Yeah,
What's
I'm more
going
of
on
an
there?
ontologist than a metaphysician, but I do like my metaphysics a little bit. So, I mean, basically, what I think about memory is, yes, in our daily life we can train it, and I know how to train it, and I've done pretty good in Like, there's no way I would remember orchestrated objective reduction if I hadn't actually used memory techniques. Like, I had to do
Mm.
that. But there's a great line Jeffrey Klempner has, is the game is finding out what the is. And so, in terms of daily life and so forth, when I have time to just sit around and do philosophy, I'm more an ontologist than a metaphysician. But uh, to the reincarnation thing, I mean, people have told me, they said, "Man, you're a lot like Giordano Bruno," and I heard that 3 times before that I actually went and looked up more. But I'd read about it, but it's sort of in passing, and it wasn't all that interesting. And then I was just like, "That's so weird." And then it's a terrifying idea, actually, that you would be the reincarnation of someone who was burned at the stake. And I don't think that that's true. But what's interesting to me about it, and I know you may know this guy as well. There's a guy named John Michael Greer. He apparently believes quite strongly in reincarnation, and I've never looked into exactly how and in which ways that he does. I'm sure his is just as nuanced as mine, and would be surprising as opposed to the common parlance about that. But what interests me about that is that, and I think Bruno would probably say something like this himself, is kind of the Spinoza thing looked at a different way, is that there's only so many things that can happen. There's a constraint, or what's called sometimes recursion. So if you think about infinity and all the things that could happen in the way the game is set, it's actually not that there can be infinite things that happen. What happens is that there are sets of things. And inside those sets, they start to refer to themselves. And so then you have repetition. And so ontologically speaking, what is it that builds repetition? And you might think, well, and Nietzsche said it's the eternal return of the same. Actually, there's a little bit more nuance because he used 3 different words in German for this idea: Wiederholen, Wiederkommen, and so on. The third one I haven't memorized yet because it's got a religious spin on it, and it's quite an unusual word. And I'm not sure why he uses it, but Heidegger goes on about it for pages. The thing is that the return is not necessarily from the same. It could also be that it's from pure difference, but we don't know. I would bet on difference. So what I'm trying to say in some way that makes sense instead of gobbledygook is that if I was a reincarnation of anybody, right? How would it be possible for me to be that same person when this is this and that is that? What seems to me more likely is that there's only so many ways for things to be: tendencies, trends, ocean in the personality types, openness and agreeableness
Mm.
and all this sort of stuff. Neuroticism, I'm probably pretty quite neurotic, but there's only so many things. We've noticed this. And then this is where that limit thing comes in. And I say, I don't know if there's limits. And I really don't know if there's limits or not. But there does seem to be recursion. And it seems to
Mm.
be that it doubles back on itself. But the idea that this would be a reincarnation of the same doesn't make sense to me. What it seems to me is that it's a reincarnation of the difference that it was built out of in the first place. Because
Mm.
any person in the past was themselves just bubbling up out of the craziness of reality doing its thing. They themselves were built from the difference. And
Mm.
the fact that it echoes or has an appearance of the same is pattern, and it's category, and it's often our confusion of category. And this
Mm.
is ultimately why Bruno got burnt at the stake, because he was just like, you guys are confusing this issue. Here's why. They literally took off 2 weeks or something because they said, why won't you admit that Christ is Christ, the Son of God, or whatever? He's like, dude, I don't even believe in a person. Like, how am I? How the status of the individual doesn't make any sense. So why are you pressuring me to say that Jesus is right? And they took 2 weeks off to discuss this because they were like, "Hot damn, that guy might be right." And I'm not kidding. Like, at that time, the Pope was actually overseeing debates about whether Jesus had free will or not. Super fascinating stuff. And Bruno's like, free will. There is no such thing as a person, let alone free will. Like, give me your head a shake.
I can see why people have said your reincarnation of him. That now makes sense. um, so, um, coming out of you said at the start, because pull me out if I go too far down a rabbit hole, but I'm kind of like, I think I've just like gone so far down with you. I'm like, we need a third person to pull us both out. But coming back to the original kind of intention for this conversation, this part of me, it's just like the whole thing's just sort of like disappearing as we speak. So I don't
This
know
is
how
my
well.
real job. This is my real vocation. Throw a wrench.
So I'm gonna pick one of there was two different things I was talking about. One was kind of formation of identity, and the other one was spiritual awakening. Um, let's go for one of them, and if we can try and have it on like a mundane-ish level
You mean I haven't
first.
demonstrated that I'm awake yet? It's true. I haven't had coffee yet. It's 6:51 a.m. in Australia.
So from a kind of like more mundane lens initially, we can totally go down a rabbit hole next. From a more mundane lens, scientific lens, kind of like how people generally talk about such things.
Mm.
What do you see is the role of memory in this notion of kind of us forming this sense of self, who we are?
Mm.
How does memory form that?
Well, I have to be a bit of an armchair psychologist, but one thing that fascinates me is the role of what's called implicit memory. So that's a memory where you just remember stuff automatically. So
Mm,
explicit memory would be, oh, I really have to memorize this term, right? And so then you do something, and then, oh, I have to
mm,
recall this. So you do something explicitly to cause yourself to recall it. But implicit memory is, when people say, well, that's just the way I am, I can't change, right?
mm,
Or someone is like, you're a lot like your dad, that sort of thing, right? Well, that's the effect of implicit memory in many ways. And there's things that I just that is such a giant topic, just that one kind of memory, and I study as much of it as I can.
mm,
And one of the specific areas of it that I'm interested in a lot is that some relatively recent researchers have thought about the connection between implicit memory and suicide. And so, if we could solve that issue, that would be probably pretty cool. But undoubtedly, it would be a great thing, except for certain, end of life things where it's not like a depression or whatever. But some research in suicide is that Night Falls Fast, I think it's called. Kay Redfield Jameson. She wrote in there that like so many suicides are actually spontaneous. Like someone just sort of they're not thinking about it for years, but they just sort of, okay, now today or whatever. Like a really high percentage of them. Um,
really?
and so, I'm a little too old to go and get the degrees that would allow me to work on it in any official sense. I'm not too old to go and do it, but I've got my own jam now with making jokes about things. The thing is that if let's just say this, if we wanted to really see the world change instead of history repeating itself all the time, we're going to need to figure out a way that implicit memory, when we're young, gets more good stuff into it and less bad. And we're living in such a time where some of that is happening. But we're also living in a time where people are cranking down on categories all the time, and young people are going to remember that, and they're not going to have an easy time getting out of it. And some of them aren't going to get out of it at all, which is sad. But we have to have our categories, and we have to know that categories are not real at the same time, or the
Mm,
realness of categories is a power game. And everything is power has become quite vogue in the last decade or so or whatnot. But I don't think the people who do that have read their Foucault very carefully. Foucault warned against a lot of the ways that power has been used recently, and yeah, I mean, people are free to misinterpret things, but I don't think that that was what he was going for. And he wrote about biopower and, caution against what's happening now, where people are saying, well, my identity is this, therefore, biologically, surgically, make this happen, right? Well, I'm all for all that stuff. I just want people to do whatever they do. But there's also a pharmaceutical thing that sees your identity and is just like, hot damn, we're going to sell you the chemicals and the upgrades and the maintenance surgeries for the rest of your life. Isn't that great? And you believe in your category so strongly that you will actually fight for the right to pay us.
Mm.
And that is what Foucault warned against. And people have used Foucault to actually get buy-in to sell themselves to the economics of category.
Mm.
So implicit memory has a lot to do with this.
So
To
would
bring
you
it back,
join the dots for me on what you saying that
I'm going to
link
get canceled.
between um what's going on with what you were saying in terms of implicit memory and suicide? Would you join the
Mm.
dots there? Why is that? Or do we
I don't
know? Or
know.
what's your sense of that? And what is it like? Like what exactly? Like what is known about that? Because I feel like I missed a link there.
I don't know because it's in K. Redfield Jameson's book and it's in the research of the scientists who work on implicit memory and suicide. I can track down what I've seen and so forth. And again, I started this. I'm an armchair psychologist, and I'm fascinated by that. And then I maybe take liberties with it, but when I become a philosopher about it, this is what I see. Like it makes sense. If we want true reform where more people are truly happy, then it. I mean, I think I'm not a historian or whatever, but when you see history and Spartan armies and all this stuff. Like I think I remember reading that they would just literally take children from their parents. In fact, I think there was a period of history where they had what Artaud called the cradle of blood and sperm. Like people didn't know who their parents were, and they trained them to protect empire. You are a soldier for the empire, and your father and your mother is the empire, right? And they get that in your
Mm,
memory very very early, and that's what you are, right? So when you live in a world where implicit memory is making you remember things automatically that lock behaviors in place that you just automatically do because that's what you've observed your parents do. I know this from myself. I saw my dad throw objects violently at walls, and lo and behold, guess what I did before I got intervened? I threw objects at walls. Like it's just
mm,
like it didn't come. There's no way tabula rasa that a guy like me is going to be saying, okay, so how am I going to solve this problem? I know, I'll throw something at a wall and then
mm,
have to hire a carpenter to come and seal it. Like that just doesn't make sense. But what does make sense is seeing countless times as a youth, this is how the problem is dealt with, and then it just happens automatically. So
mm,
now to get to suicide, I don't know exactly what the explanation is there, but I do know that we live in a world where a lot of people see suicide or hear of suicide as a solution. And if it's in, and I believe this is what the research is saying, is that if it's in implicit memory as a possible solution, later a trigger can make it fire off. And this is the argument for meat as a machine. It's meat acting mechanically
mm,
through an engine of memory or a level of memory or whatever metaphor that we want to apply to it. And it's in my behavior. I see it in my behavior, and it links exactly back to my point about how that every word that comes out of my mouth is a production. It's a performance of the training that I have undergone, and it explains for the differences in how other people make utterances, what they say, how they say it, and we have to learn not to judge each other because they can't be otherwise.
Mm. It's actually, I want to ask this first before I go to where I was just thinking. So what do we know about what what shapes someone having? And the words "better" and "worse" aren't really the right words, but I can't think of like a, I guess, more effective implicit memory versus a less effective one. And by effective, I mean one that remembers a lot versus one that remembers less. What shapes that? Why do some people have an implicit memory that remembers more?
Well, I don't know that implicit memory would be a more or less question. Um, but if we were talking about why do some people have like a natural ability to recall facts and details, that's more the realm of semantic memory. Or people who remember more of their lives may have stronger autobiographical memory. In fact, there's something, it used to be called hyperthymesia, but now they tend to call it highly superior autobiographical memory. And
So that doesn't feel still fit within the realm of implicit memory. They're kind of like, it seems like
well,
it's still
we would want to
implicit,
ask a
but
real psychologist rather than the armchair psychologist. But I don't, just in what I've understood, I don't see this is the thing, right? Like if we're going to do the science of it all, right? Then the reason why we use the word implicit memory is to separate it from the other kinds of memory that could be
mm,
involved. So having better memory, you could be right. I mean, or where I think your intuition is going, you could be right that the person who enacts the behavior of another person because of childhood imprinting, let's say, maybe has better implicit memory than others. I don't know, but these are like let's get ourselves canceled questions, right? Like because then it gets into IQ and so forth. I mean, I'm serious. Like these are risky places, and there
mm,
are people who have many things to say about this that are not being allowed to speak about it, or if they do, it's under duress. Right? Richard Heyer, for example, he thinks that IQ is. I mean, I'm not going to say that I think I understand all this stuff, but from what I understand of Richard Heyer, like he thinks there might be a pill coming for IQ in the future, right? That would help, so to speak, even the scales. But then the implication of that is that the reason why some people struggle is because they have a low IQ, which is a very risky thing to say, right? But I can tell you, I wish my IQ was higher. I think I have a very low IQ. I'm so dumb, I can't even believe it sometimes, you know? I'm lucky I haven't. Speaking of suicide, like it's just, I'm shatteringly unintelligent in the ways that I wish that I could be. It's depressing to the nth degree, right? So, I come back to thank goodness I developed some kind of spiritual practice that helped me stop thinking in category, stop thinking in, oh, well, this word describes this thing, so therefore true, you know, like that sort of thing,
mm,
and just dissolve or neutralize all that crap. Katakarinaka, I think they say in Sanskrit, something like that. The dissolving of the chalk in water, you know, constant
mm.
practice constant practice neutralizes ignorance like a base neutralizes an acid, something like this. You know, that would be the
Mm.
modernization of the Sanskrit because it's I think it's talking about like some specific chalk that goes in the water
That
and
we've got no
disperses.
idea. So, talking about your spiritual practice,
Mm.
um, and going back to what you were saying earlier about having memorized all of this Sanskrit, that it, that's quite mind-blowing in itself that you've done that. Am I right in thinking um that has had a kind of, it sounds in some ways obvious that it would have some kind of effect, but I don't get the impression you went at it with that. It could have been something else that you memorized, but it sounds as though that had a profound effect on you. Would you share a bit more about that? Because I find that whole thing really fascinating.
Oh yeah, it's because I'm a stubborn jerk that it all happened, or I used to be. Basically, I got into the memory training world and I was quite successful at it. And a guy named Ben, who used to have a website called Project Monkey Mind, he, we were in a blogging network group or whatever. And he said, oh, you're in Brisbane now. Let's hang out. So we met and we were just talking about stuff. And I'd had a meditation practice for many years, but as an atheist, like I was stuck in the category. I was so stuck in the category of atheist. It's just like, here's my atheist hammer, bang. And he said, have you ever thought of adding mantras or something to your meditation practice? And I'm like, are you kidding? This spiritual crap. That's, and then I went on a tirade about this, that, and the other thing. And speaking of implicit memory, all the pain that I felt from sitting in church, forced to listen to stuff that I thought was obviously not only not true, but not even particularly respectful to what is said on the page, right? And later I learned a bit of biblical Hebrew in university, and I got even more angry about it because it doesn't say what people say that it says, right? So I had all this baggage, all this pain around anything related to any religion. And basically he knew the right thing to say, I guess, because he said, well, there's this guy named Gary Weber, and he was kind of science minded too, and he needed an essentially, I don't know, maybe not atheist, but a non spiritual spirituality sort of thing. And he said he memorized all this Sanskrit. And
spirituality for non-spiritual people.
yeah, well, or maybe it's spirituality for dummies. I don't know, but it is a kind of stupidity. I'm happy to admit that. Like, I was so dumb. I was so caught in this identity. Like, atheism is real. It must be a force that fights against the evil believers. Like it was that epic. And I've been lucky enough to tell this story at a TEDx event, and millions of people have seen the video. And unfortunately, I have scripting errors in that, because there's a lot of atheists who are like, stop watching when you said you weren't an atheist anymore. And it's just like, oh man, why did I write it that way? I could have written it a different, but because I'm still like atheist friendly or whatever. I just don't care about the categories. Anyway, Ben said this guy, he memorized the Sanskrit, and then his thoughts stopped. And I was like, this is BS. There's no way that you're going to memorize a bunch of Sanskrit and then you're going to stop thinking, because I was generally aware that, blissful states of like nothingness was the goal. And I just like, that doesn't even make sense. I'd already tried to reach it just sitting just to sit. And I just,
and can I just, before you go here, at that point, was it that you felt that was something you wanted because of pain that you were in? Was it a kind of like you were in a place of struggle and you saw that could be the relief? Or was it
which,
coming
when I
from a different
meditated
place?
before, or when I
No, the
started
idea of, if I can, have less thinking, that will produce a different kind of experience. What was the motivation there?
as I remember the situation, I literally got the book and started to memorize the Sanskrit because I thought it was nonsense, and I'm a scientific minded person, but I'm a weird scientific minded person. I'm like an immersion journalist. So, in the sense that you actually do the thing that you're journaling. And there's a quite famous book called Moonwalking with Einstein, where Joshua Foer, he was just a journalist and he got a story to write about memory competitions. And then he thought, well, I'm going to actually try these techniques. And he wound up becoming the USA memory champion of a particular year. I think he didn't win the first year, but then the second year he went back and he won it. So he was a true immersion journalist in the sense that he didn't disbelieve. He actually tried to prove it wrong, and he wound up winning. So that's why I went in on this, because I thought,
yes,
this would be
but
so.
you said, like, I agree. I'm not saying that's not true. I think that is totally true.
I think
But
it is. I don't know. Maybe it was different.
well, I could be wrong on this. I just feel like something you said earlier gave the impression that it was like, and like, I'm going to do this thing. It's probably a load of rubbish, and I'm going to find out by going and
Oh,
doing the
oh,
thing. And
I see. Yeah.
yet, if it does produce the result, yay, that's a good result to have.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Well, I'm sure that's in the mix because, like I said, I had meditated for years already, and
Mm.
I was well aware of many of the goals or the things on the package that were promised. Like, I didn't know the term nirvikalpa samadhi at that time, but I knew those kinds of ideas, right? And I knew Buddha, and I'd read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse when I was in high school. So, like, I'm sure that was part of the thing. It's like, wow, like, if I
Mm.
really can do this, sure. But
But it wasn't that you were desperate for the thing. It was just kind of like,
Well,
Why
I don't know.
not?
I mean, in a way, I was desperate. I mean, it's a complicated story. We'd be here all day if I went into every little nook and cranny. But I was desperate because I, like everybody else, am in complete suffering. Unless I'm paying attention. And that suffering hasn't gone away just because I've had an awakening. I mean, I have to still pay attention. I still have to practice. As I told Steve on Guru Viking, I did a stupid idea. I was like, man, I wonder what happens if I stop my daily practice, and boom, like all the suffering comes to fill the void really quickly. So I'm glad, and
Mm.
I was actually worried for a while I wasn't going to be able to. I never totally dropped the practice, but I was worried I wouldn't be able to get back to the level that I'd reached before, so to speak. It was really wild, but I don't know where I am now. I'm pretty good, I guess, but it's not like reality goes away or anything like that. Anyway, back to that story. As I remember it, like I literally just, because the way Ben said it, he was just like, well, you can memorize all this Sanskrit. It was like a challenge. It was the mythical hero's journey, right? The wizard call to
Mm.
adventure, and
You make
I
a good
took it.
wizard.
I
Mm.
took it, but I took it on the basis of I'm going to prove this wrong. And that when we think about implicit memory, right? I'm a trained scholar. I took courses in science. So even though I'm not really a scientist in the sense that I run or I work at a university anymore. I used to work in a university though, and when I did, I was a film professor, but I was focused on what's called reader response theory. And reader response theory is like literally looking at what are the survey results, what were the ticket sales, like literally. Here's our hypothesis. This movie's going to make this much money. Did it or didn't it? How do we know? So we just look at this distribution facts. I was really into these granular details, and then the aesthetic truth, right? Like what makes a movie good? Is it good
Mm.
because Joe, who makes a zine in Seattle, is like, man, this is so painful to watch this movie, and I know everybody will hate it, but I love the pain, so therefore it's good? Or is it good because it made billions of dollars, right? And I don't know the answers to the question, but those were the kinds of things
Mm.
that I used
Mm.
to do intellectually, because I used to do zines. I am the guy in Joe who says this movie is so strange and obscure, and I know people will never be able to sit for it through it, and that's why it's great. So, but I also am fascinated by, and I've worked in the film industry. I'm fascinated by the question, like, what would make this stupid story so successful, right? Like, there must be something scientifically in there. So I've even actually gone out of my way to write pot boilers, they're called, like literally try to write a bestseller. And what's the science of it, just to see if I can do it. And actually,
Mm.
so far, so good. Uh, but I've also gone out of my way to write, well, if you really want to know, this book has some of the most obscure and painful writing that you'll ever hear. That is, I was reading it last night. I just pulled it off the shelf for some reason. And I was like, what am I talking about? I can't even understand my own damn book. Like, I'm trying to make it hard to read. Anyway, and it was a test to see if I could literally somehow be an icon in or somehow gain purchase, somehow be successful in experimental literature. And it was reviewed, and somebody said we need to make a new category for this, and he called it slurrealism. So I won. I got my category prize. Woo! It was reviewed in a book and was given a new title. I literally wanted to prove this wrong. I wanted to be the guy who was able to say, did it, been there, doesn't work. But the problem is it did work. It did work. I did
Mm.
experience persistent non-symbolic experience. But then I was that jerk who was like, I don't like persistent non-symbolic experience. I'm going to call it sustained and enduring neo-symbolic experience because that makes more sense to me. But what I didn't do is say everybody else should accept that term. I just made it new
Mm.
for myself because I don't find it non-symbolic. I find it neo-symbolic.
And what do you mean by that?
I don't know. I mean, I do, but I don't, because it would just be so many words to explain the difference. But when I think of something non-symbolic, it would mean that I couldn't later symbolize it. So with all due
Mm.
respect to Jeffrey Martin, if you're going to say, well, we came out of this experience, or we're living in this non-symbolic experience, and here's my 50-page report on it where I have the term persistent non-symbolic experience.
Mm.
Well, wait a second. Stop. This is the argument that Giordano Bruno had with Aristotle.
Yes, you're describing symbols in order to even attribute the levels to
there
this. Yeah.
it had to be symbolic in order to be
Mm.
symbolized, right?
Yes.
Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
well, I don't want to be dogmatic about that. I want to be philosophical about it. I want to ask the question:
Mm.
doesn't it have to be symbolic? And this is the or sorry, in Plato, I think it's either in the Statesman or it's in the. I think it's in the Statesman. Let's go with that. In the Statesman, they basically, and I already said this today, they say, is the opposite of being non-being. So another way of saying this is that it's turtles all the way down. It's symbols all the way down. It's reality
Mm.
building itself out of itself by reference to what? To nothing? No, not, the very fact that we have a word for nothing already means we're referring to something, right?
Mm.
We're symbolizing. Nietzsche says somewhere, I think it's Nietzsche, he says, the night is also a kind of sun. Like it's so it's just so obvious. We're in this referential frame, and the only way that we do anything is in reference to another thing, right?
Mm.
Um, what that other thing is, I don't know. But anyway, these are Gary Weber is very good on this. He's just like, you guys with your, he doesn't say it this way, but you guys with your intellectual noodling. I mean, just shut up and chant.
Mm.
It's like, it's just so like you could talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about, but my answer to Weber is that's what I'm doing right now. Like now that the change has happened, I'm just enjoying it. Say this, say that, as Kierkegaard
Mm.
says. Either way, you're gonna regret it. Like it's just it's just happening, and enjoy the ride. We're just meat strapped to a planet, and it's just going. It's just happening. It is so amazing when you pay attention to it.
So, what do you, having done that experiment, and the experiment annoyingly worked, coming back to, if we can, before we finish this episode, attempt to get back to my original question. Oh, not my original question, but the kind of the idea for this conversation. What was going on there in your learning of those texts, the memorizing those texts, having that shifting experience? What's going on there? What's going on there with memory? Why is that happening? What's your sense of that? What can we learn about that when it comes to, I guess, spiritual awakening, but also what's going on when that's not happening?
Well, here's the exciting thing: we don't just have to rely on one dude's research. So the Jeffrey Martin research, it cross indexes with other things, right? So what appears to be happening in an awakening that lasts, where you switch, you change, is that a lot of people, and I certainly was, and sometimes I still am, we're locked in what's called default mode network, which I point here because that's what the brain scans suggest, right? And default mode network is my life, me, tomorrow, yesterday, got to do this. Oh, I did that. Oh, I just said a stupid thing. Oh, maybe they'll edit it. Like it'll be fine. Like blah 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 blah. But then there's this other thing called task positive network, and that's perhaps the scans light up around this part of the brain, and task positive network is a lot like, well, Csikszentmihalyi, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I think you say his name. I don't know. There's like 50,000 ways people pronounce his name, but he had that thing called flow, right? Flow states. And if you can get in flow and stay in flow, well, if the brain is real and it's a piece of meat in a skull, then all you got to do is do practices that keep you in the task positive network, so that no matter how bad things are, it's just now, 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 now. And when this default mode network wants to be like scarcity, lack, fear, tomorrow, what if, blah, 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 you at least have a chance to pull it back into the now. If we even understand what now is, which orchestrated objective reduction will tell you we don't. But anyway, we'll just give Eckhart Tolle his power of now. Like it works good enough, right? That's what's happening. And you can train. This is my fundamental thesis that I never get enough time to work on. And I am quite aware that I'm never going to like start a cult or a religion or whatnot, where it's like, okay, guys, this is the task positive network. Right? Like, and here's what you're going to do. Level,
You don't know. There might be a market for it.
well, there is, and I don't want it, right? Because it's seductive. It becomes an object of power because I get to be the guy who solved the problem, and I don't want it, right? Because we don't need guys anymore who are just like, oh, like I think somebody told me, he said, "We'll know that you've gone the wrong way when the black shirt turns white." And what was so weird about that is like a week later, my wife was like, "You have to wear this shirt," and she brought me a white linen shirt. Anyway, the whole thing is that I haven't chosen because there is no free will. But I just happen to have had my memory trained, my implicit memory trained in such a way that I can't get myself to build the mechanism that says, okay, so we're going to train you to live in the task positive network. Here's level 1. And so now you start with this, right? Like I've done that with memory training, but I do it in a very decentralized way. Like I have a course and I have books, but just about every week I'm on YouTube with some new variation of saying the same thing in a different way, because what I really believe, and it's not me that believes it, it's just somehow this is the way that all the forces trained me to think and to work, is that nobody owns memory palaces or mnemonics. Nobody owns these special processes. Tyson Yunkaporta, he says that people like me are the custodians of memory. Lynn Kelly, in her books like The Memory Code and The Knowledge Gene, talks about how cultures create people like us, or me, and yourself, I would include. Like we are meat tubes that encapsulate some of the flow of the wisdom and the knowledge, and we pass it forward so that it might live in the next and the next and the next and the next, because we do know from history what happens when these messages get lost. And so I think it would be a grave error. I mean, I live in a world where you have to brand, so I had to call the website something, so it's called magneticmemorymethod.com. But if I had a choice, I would get rid of all the trading of clamshells, all of the extra architecture, and all of the corporations, and just, I don't know, have people show up and we talk about memory, or we talk about whatever we want to talk about that day. I would just have it different, but it's not different. It is the way that it is. So I interpret it as I've been made to interpret it. But what I don't do, well, let me put it this way, to go with the theme of the podcast. I believe very, very much in the power of myth. But I've never forgotten, and this is my own implicit memory training, I guess, because I bought into it hook, line, and sinker. I don't know whether it's right or wrong. But Nietzsche said, it's not that the myths are the problem. It's which myths you choose. But humans are cursed to be the bearers, the creators of myths. So choose wisely. And then he says, be like Nietzsche. But that's an impossible thing to do. But you can think about it. And if you can think critically about it, I think what you'll find is that he's right. Myth is forced upon us. We are myth generating machines, but we are also myth absorbing machines. So the idea of implicit memory gives a part of an explanation of what it is in memory that does that. But I also am an absorber of myth. And this is what I mean when I'm so dumb. If I was a smarter guy, I would just be thinking about, okay, so instead of giving away hours and hours and hours, like literally hundreds of videos of free content, trying to wrangle some traffic to a website with like, get my free course, right? If I was a smarter person, I would look at the world for what it is, and I would figure out how to make a Google ad and a Facebook ad campaign, make millions and millions of dollars, and then I would get a boat and I would sit there and laugh and chuckle and hang around with other fat cats who are pleased with their cash, and I would just like live in this facile, insubstantial world, except for that's the myth. I don't know them from the sun. They too could be sitting there reading Sanskrit on their boats and being like, that stupid Anthony guy doesn't even know that I bought his course. to support him in his own journey, right? So I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but at the end of the day, I mean, we're all in our own little prison house of language, and we're all in our own little prison house of symbols, and we're all in our own little prison house of myths. But Nietzsche's challenge was, and it's one that I took very, very seriously, and I don't even know why I took it seriously, but I did, is he said, go to the coldest place. Literally live it, right? Whatever it is, live it. 100%. All or nothing. Say yes. So I'm just lucky that I somehow have that in my character. But I don't know that I would wish it on anybody else. And I don't want their suffering either. So, and this is where our storytelling come from, with the stories about curses and stories about ghosts and stories about that, is that we do have the wish that others could have our curse. I'll never forget Hitchens, saying that the number one thing about him was that he delighted in Schadenfreude. Like he just and that was so awake and aware of him to say, And isn't that the truth of us all? Why else would Germans come up with such a word?
Well, this has taken us in all kinds of places I wasn't anticipating, and I think very few of the places I was anticipating.
Oh well, I've got lots of stuff where I just talk about the boring. Okay, so here's how you build a memory palace. It's actually not that boring, but there's something about the way that the game is configured just drew this out of us, and that's part of my point, right? This is how memory works.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
Whatever comes from consciousness over there triggers something in consciousness over here, and it builds itself out of itself. And here it is.
So I feel like I would just love you to, as we close on this episode, having again gone to the most unexpected places. Someone listening to this probably at this point is just like, oh my goodness, like where even is my brain? Trying to sort of like gather themselves back together. Is there anything that you would, having explored memory in the way that you have, and it's going back to that idea of myth, there's a Jung quote. This is something like the greatest question, or the most important question anyone can ask, is what myth am I living? And I love what you said right at the beginning of the show, something like memory has been like your muse, and she's taking you to all these places, which, seems like you've landed in a pretty good place. So again, it's almost surprising to me how little, even in circles where we're that are interested in psychology, interested in spirituality, we don't often speak directly about memory, which was it was quite a surprise to me as I was thinking about this episode. Like, isn't that funny that we don't talk much about memory in itself? So this is a very long-winded way to say, before we close, is there anything that, having experienced everything you have and where memory as a muse has brought you, that you would offer to people listening?
Well, if you want to be more mythical, commit myths to memory. And if you want to be truly more spiritual, commit spiritual material to memory. It will change you. And I don't know what your adventure will be with that. You could, like, for example, when I memorized biblical Hebrew when I was in university, it changed me. And it told me something that sent me on a trajectory for many, many years. But then when I went and memorized Sanskrit, a whole new adventure happened. So just commit things to memory, and as much as possible, because it's like filling it's like your mind. There's another metaphor, a symbol. It's like your mind is a wine glass, and then you fill it with wine, and you know how it is when you drink wine and you really taste it, and the tannins and all these things that you notice, the granular details of what's going on in that wine. Well, that's what happens when you memorize text, because you think all of a sudden, oh, it's that word instead of this word. And then that is butting up or jutting up against this. And so it gets what Ezra Pound called a luminous detail. It's not this verse or that verse. It's what the two coming together produce.
Mm.
And that itself is what happened in our interview. Two things came together and they produced an unexpected luminous detail, or a series of luminous details that can't ever configure without these things happening in this way. This is what memory is, I believe, at its core. Memory is a field in which we drop seeds. And those seeds do not create plants that grow into the sky, although sometimes it does. What it does is it creates deep rhizomatic networks. And rhizomes have the character that the bulbs under the soil appear spontaneously. And they actually can connect with each other without touching. And that's what a synapse is in the brain, right? The synapses don't need to touch. There are myelin sheaths that wrap around them, but they don't actually need to touch. And in the same way that we don't need to be in the same physical room, our species has built the internet so that we can, in a non-coupling way, non-physical coupling way, actually have consciousness over here, speak to consciousness over there. But the quality of every conversation that you have is going to be amped up in an extraordinary way if you memorize and not just go from memory, because those are two different things. You know, being able to say, I don't know, Turtva, Moharnavam, Hatva, Ragadvesh, Dirakshashan, Yoga, Shanta Santa Yuktatma, Ramo Varajate. That's a very different proposition than saying, yeah, you know, there's this verse and it says something to this effect, right? Knowing it in the original language and then being able to say, well, you could translate it this way, you could translate it that way. What do you think, right? And then if that person says, oh, no, we got to also take into account tapo bhikshina papinam, blah, 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 right? Like that's a quality of conversation that only people who memorize get to have. And then you have to watch your own ego, because then, you know, I can already feel myself feeling too good about myself. But my point is that memory itself can help you watch your own ego so that you don't get too proud, but you actually just enjoy it for what it is. In the same way that you don't need anybody to observe you enjoying a glass of wine. You just enjoy that sucker, right? And that's what this is. You just enjoy, and you're never alone ever again. And that is the promise of the spiritual text, is to be one. But it doesn't say that you have to be in a room with other people to be one. You might. That might be your jam. But at the end of the day, memorize. Anyway, that Sanskrit that I recited, one way to translate it, and I think it's one of the best things you can memorize, and really memorize it so that you operate this way in the world, is it says something to the effect, like there's different ways of translating it. Those who kill the like-dislike monster in the ocean of delusion arrive in tranquility.
Oh. Well, that feels like a beautiful place to end this episode. Yeah, that really was a treat. Thank you. Where can listeners find out more about you and I get the impression if people go to your website, they're probably going to find a completely different version of you to the one I just experienced.
But not too different. Because the first thing I'm going to do is, okay, get out a piece of paper and a pen. And I really do mean it. So there's a little bit of school marm stuff, but like if you're going to do it, do it. And maybe you don't need the pen and paper. I don't know, but chances are, I mean, I'm a dumb person, right? So when I take a course, I actually just do what the guy says, or the person says, whoever is teaching the course. And I really get detailed about it. And that's why I have a website in the first place, is because I actually just, okay, so here's the box, and then step 1, step 2, step 3, and I just follow it, right? So that's another gift that you can give teachers. Don't question everything, definitely question. I'm not saying don't question, but this will just go on to another big speech. But at the end of the day, yes, it's a little bit different at magneticmarymethod.com, but not too different. It's not too different. But I got variety. So if you don't learn from my step-by-step instruction manual, I wrote this novel, a detective novel, about a guy who can't get out of his own head and he can't follow the instructions. So a bad guy gives him a situation where he definitely has to follow the instructions, and he memorizes some stuff. And so far people like it. I mean, I'm working on part two, and part two is so mind melting. I don't even understand it, but I'll get there. But part one is the pot boiler that I referred to. Like, can I actually write something that is just normal, that that you could actually read to the end without ever being confused, And I actually succeeded. I didn't think I'd be able to do it, but it's just a normal detective. Okay, there's a couple of things.
To be honest, I'm surprised.
There's a couple of things that are not normal about it. Like, I don't want to give any spoiler alerts, but there's certain action scenes that would probably be a stretch in reality. But like, it literally takes place. I made it the rule. This has to take place in reality. The sequel, not so much, but the sequel hasn't appeared yet. In any case, you don't have to learn it from a course. You can also learn it from a novel. I got books for kids that are coming out soon that are like 30 pages each, and they break down the individual memory techniques. They're secretly for parents and teachers, but kids will. So far, they've been tested on kids, and the kids love them. The first thing they say is, "Give me more exercises." So that's a sign of success.
Oh wow!
But yeah, I literally have focused on just the teaching of memory techniques, and because I have the spiritual element, certain people find me, and that's always a blessing to be able to spend time on that, because I think it's the most important part. And I think that a lot more people will quote unquote get what Meister Eckhart was talking about. I think of him because we talked about nothing today. And in Sermon 19, he talks about Acts 9:8, where Saul rose up from the ground, eyes wide open, and saw nothing. But Meister Eckhart says, it's so funny. He says, no. There's actually 4 different kinds of nothing. Anyway, that's Sermon 19. If you want to be able to remember all that stuff, that's what I do, right? That's what I help people do. The only thing is you have to do it. I wish I could do it for you because it's so much fun. But I understand that memory training, different people come at it different. I've seen people pick it up in 2 hours and be able to recite 100 digits of pi, like literally after that short of a period of time. But I've seen people take 2 years to just wrap their head around a memory palace. So I'm here to answer all the questions about the techniques themselves. Just, if my style doesn't work, there's another dude teaching the same thing down the street, maybe with a little less passion, maybe never answers their email, but they're there. And it's the same. You can read Giordano Bruno, the guy who got burned at the stake. He's saying the same things that I say, but in really difficult, Renaissance era language that hasn't. I'm working on a translation that modernizes it now, but even then, there will be people who struggle to understand it. So just find something that makes sense to you and start to use memory techniques. And later you'll come and you'll look at what I'm saying and you're like, oh, now I get it, right? Because I just am who I am and I teach it the way I teach it, but there's lots of ways to teach it. So really, I like magneticmarymethod.com. Obviously, I'm like a schmuck with something to sell, and that's how I am able to do this. But the more important thing for the world is more trained memory, period. And so that's why I interview all the other people who write memory books whenever they're able and willing. That's why I talk about all their stuff. Like I mentioned Lynn Kelly today. Read Lynn Kelly. She's a better teacher of this stuff than I am in her books. So but people like both our books because then when they get it, they go, oh, well, now that's a whole different proposition because I talk about it in a different way and I point out the Bruno stuff. And anyway, sorry, I'm going on here too long, but I don't care about this or that book about memory. What I care about is that people do it. And I'm in the business of cheerleading more than anything else. I hope because it's not mine. It's just stuff floating through meat. Information.
Devotion to your muse. Well,
yeah, her name is Nemesis, by the way. I think that's how you pronounce it. Could be Nemesune in ancient Greek, but there is a goddess of memory.
Yes, there is. There is.
I
Well,
haven't
maybe,
gone through any
maybe
rituals to give my soul to her, but she appears once in a while. I'm sure it's her.
I wonder if we have a second episode in us to come back and talk a bit more about, because I think I had the notion that the conversation we've had has been perfect, and I think I didn't really want to go too directly into memory itself, and memorize memory techniques. But I actually wonder whether that would be. I've seen, particularly what you were saying at the end there. It's so obvious in a way. It's one of those simple things that's easy to overlook. It's kind of whatever it is, spend time memorizing it and you'll become it. It's kind of obvious, but it's just we want it to be harder than that, but perhaps easier than that at the same time. So
You'll become it, or
perhaps we
you'll
come
realize
back
that
and do
it wasn't what you thought it
well,
was, and then you'll go
yes.
on to something that is more appropriate.
So maybe we come back
Well,
another time and we'll focus on that.
Giordano Bruno bragged that he could teach the entire art of memory in under an hour. And so we could see if I can
Oh,
reproduce that. I,
okay.
I think we can do it. I think we can do it in 15 minutes, but teaching does not mean that it is taught. I think that it's a, I'm happy to go through the whole thing, slides, whatever you like. The whole thing is that teaching it doesn't mean it's taught. So whatever we do it on the understanding that the individual has to actually develop the mnemonic systems and use them. Because that's where it starts.
Yes.
Listening is not application. So, but I'm like, look, it's the most beautiful hidden secret. You could talk about it for free all day long because people do ultimately, or enough people just need a little bit of assistance that they're willing to get it, right? So I always teach it freely, just very, very happily,
Mm.
because teaching isn't taught. It's taught you to, you teach it yourself by doing it.
Yeah. Well, let's definitely do that then. For now, thank you so much. This has been a real delight journeying down those rabbit holes with you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it and look forward to the next time.